Hello! This is a video on mallet selection and playing zones, also known as what to hit what with and where to hit what with what. Special thanks to Edmonton-based percussionist Jaden Baudouin for recommending to me that I do this video. It's definitely an important topic to touch on. You can find his great content by looking up Jaden Eric Baudouin, but I'll also post a link to his channel underneath all the time indexing for this video that you can click on when you click the About link. So we're going to be talking about mallet selection, playing zones for a variety of instruments. We'll also touch a little bit up on composers. Like you'll see in your manuscript that a composer will tell you to use a particular thing to hit an instrument or to scrape an instrument. Sometimes their advice is good, sometimes their advice is bad, but it still needs to be taken into consideration when you make a decision. So the instruments we have here today are triangle, suspended cymbal, wind chimes, snare drum, tom-tom, hand drums, bongos we're going to use for this, but what we talk about will also apply to congas, djembe, etc. We have a tambourine, we have a granite block, and then we have two different types of wood block. And we also have an orchestral bass drum. For mallets, we have a wide variety of mallets. Some of them are fairly high-end and some of them are not so high-end. I've chosen a wide variety of mallets because oftentimes in an educational setting you won't necessarily have super high-end mallets, but it's still very easy to get a great sound out of an instrument without super high-end. So some of them are made by Mallet, some by Vic Firth, some by Innovative Percussion, some by Mike Balter, some by St. John's Music, some by Torque. So we have soft timpani mallets, medium hard timpani mallets, very hard quasi-baroque timpani mallets. We have Vic Firth CS1 Becken mallets specifically designed for suspended cymbal. Sometimes they're not actually the best suspended cymbal solution, we'll talk about that. Some Innovative Percussion soft yarn, Innovative Percussion medium soft yarn, Torque medium yarn, Mallet medium chord vibraphone mallets, and we have some yarn mallets with a very hard core inside of them. We have some Los Cabos soft rubber mallets that I use for practicing on glockenspiel and a variety of other things. We have some medium rubber, we've got medium latex, hard rubber, medium Teflon, hard Teflon, medium plastic, hard plastic, medium acrylic, hard acrylic, brass, snare drum sticks, 6 different triangle beaters, and 3 different coins. So we may as well start with the suspended cymbal. Composers will give you a variety of different instructions. Sometimes they'll tell you to use a snare drum stick on the suspended cymbal. If they're telling you that, then they're probably telling you that because they want the suspended cymbal to serve a time-keeping role, or they want the contact sound of the crash to be very vivid and clear and precise and articulate. So if they just tell you to play the suspended cymbal with a stick and it's a repeated pattern, then you're probably going to want to play it similarly to where you would play a ride cymbal. And I've got a drum set video where I go over that in some detail, but about halfway between where the dome starts and the edge of the cymbal, about here. The reason why you want to play it there is because if you play it too close to the dome, the sound is kind of tinny and shrill and ugly. If you play it too far out, it's a nice sound, but the cymbal rings a lot and ends up covering up your contact sound. And then you don't get as much contact sound, or at least you'll be able to hear it, but by the time it gets out to the audience, after having been treated by the room that you're playing in, the audience might not hear it as clearly, so it tends to be good about there. If it's just one crash and you're doing it with a stick, then striking on the edge with the shaft of the stick tends to be good. You can also strike with the shaft of the stick across the edge of the cymbal and get a harsher sound out of the cymbal if you want to. But with respect to soft mallet solutions, often, especially in earlier music when composers were just starting to write for the suspended cymbal, which happens in a lot of later orchestral music, like Bartók for example, but also early wind band / military band music, and 2 composers who come to mind who have written this instruction include Gustav Holst and Rolf von Williams. and they'll actually tell you to use timpani mallets on the suspended cymbal. This is an example of a bad instruction. Now, of course, Vaughan Williams, Holst, and Bartók were great composers. The reason why they're telling you to use timpani mallets is because timpani mallets were the only soft mallet solution that existed at the time. Yarn mallets did not really exist yet because yarn mallets are primarily made for marimba, and marimba had not been westernized yet at that time. So they'll tell you to use timpani mallets on the suspended cymbal. However, the harsh surface of the bronze, especially if it's a cast bronze cymbal, is bad for the mallet and it'll tear it apart. It's one of the reasons why, if you're teaching in a school setting, your timpani mallets might be totally frayed apart and a complete mess. That might be one of the reasons why, is because people are using them on cymbals. So even if the composer tells you timpani mallets, do not use timpani mallets, use a yarn mallet. Generally, when you're using a soft mallet on the suspended cymbal, it's because you're doing a roll most of the time. I'd say maybe 8 to 9 times out of 10. So obviously you want to roll with the mallets as far apart from one another as possible. If you roll closer to the middle, you'll actually be able to hear the contacts of the mallets hitting. And you don't want that. So the further apart you play, the less you can hear the contacts. You can still hear the contacts a little bit with these mallets, and these mallets aren't necessarily the best suspended cymbal mallets that there are. I actually like to use medium soft marimba mallets instead. You should be able to hear the contacts even less. When I use these mallets. So there's a little bit about rolling on the suspended cymbal. Obviously, if you're when you're rolling, you want to make sure that you don't overtake yourself with too much volume. So that's another thing that the mallets are good for, is not only creating more sound, but tapering sound off. You can actually dampen the sound in order to gradually taper the sound off. You can also dampen the sound as a means of doing a decrescendo while still continuing to roll. Because of course, whenever you have a sustain marking, it means the instrument should sustain. It's not necessarily an instruction that's telling you to continue to hit the instrument. So if you have a roll marking but a decrescendo, then you can actually either stop hitting the instrument altogether or dampen the instrument, and the instrument will sustain while getting quieter. The other thing we're going to talk about with the suspended cymbal is scraping, and this is another ambiguous area with respect to composers' instructions, and this is in fact an example of bad instruction that a composer will give you out of just a lack of orchestrational knowledge on their part. This is something we're going to be talking about more when we talk about the wood blocks and the hand drums, but you should never use anything harder than an instrument to play an instrument. So if you actually examine how hard metal is, particular types of metal are, and there are various scientific scales for doing that. They're easy to find online. Bronze measures as a 3 on most scales. Obviously, the higher the number, the harder it is. The lower number, the softer it is. So triangle beaters, if a composer tells you to scrape the cymbal with a triangle beater, do not do that, because triangle beaters are generally made out of either steel, chrome, or iron, and those are all harder than bronze. So I have a few different types of coins, because sometimes the composer will actually tell you to scrape with a coin. Here I have a dime, a penny, and a nickel. Nickels measure 4 on the hardness scale. Bronze measures 3, so we're not going to use the nickel. Copper measures 4 as well. Bronze measures 3, so we're not going to use the penny. Dimes are made out of silver. Silver measures 2.5. Bronze measures 3, which means that you can scrape the cymbal without being worried about damaging the cymbal. You'll damage the dime, which is technically illegal in both the United States and Canada, but don't worry, no one's going to give you heck for taking a tiny little bit off the edge of a dime. So when you scrape the cymbal, just very gently place the coin down so it doesn't actually make any noise, and then pull it to the outside. You don't want to hear the sound of you prepping to scrape the cymbal before you scrape it. So you want to make sure that you place it silently on the cymbal and then scrape off. That's all we're going to talk about for suspended cymbal. Very briefly with triangle, because I do have another instructional video with triangle, and so you can check that out for a lot more information. But with triangle, you generally, almost all the time, want to use a triangle beater, a proper triangle beater, to play the instrument. If your students or if you do not have a triangle beater, do not come up with a makeshift solution like using a nail or a deck screw to play the triangle. And do not use a wind chime, a single wind chime that has fallen off of your set of wind chimes. It will make an absolutely terrible sound. Please use triangle beaters on the triangle. That's all I wanted to say about that. But moving on, we were just talking about wind chimes a little bit. So wind chimes, I've got another video on Tambourine where I talk about Tambourine and what the composer wants to hear, what the audience should hear, what the audience should not hear. So it's pretty self-explanatory when you consider the name of the instrument, wind chimes. It should sound like the wind is playing the wind chimes, not like the wind chimes are being scraped with a piece of metal. So you can actually hear, if I take a triangle beater, you can hear the metal coming in contact with the instrument, and that is not nice. It should just sound like it's being played with the wind, so you can just play along the strings like that in order to play the instrument. If you want to play from top to bottom, you might have a directional line in your score where you have a note and then top to bottom, so then you would want to do that. If you have a line that goes from low to high, then you'll want to go from low to high. And if you just have a horizontal squiggly line or a sustain marking, then you should actually make it sound like it's being played by the wind, which is to say aleatorically, so just sort of random. And that's a little bit about the wind chimes, and we can now move on. So, tambourine. Composers will often tell you to strike the tambourine with a drumstick. If you have a nice orchestral tambourine like this one, do not ever, ever, ever do that. Just use your hand. I've got a tambourine video. You can see some of the techniques in there. If you have a rock tambourine or a half moon tambourine or a mountable tambourine that's set up on your drum set, you can go ahead and hit that with sticks, but just recognize the fact that when your stick comes in contact with the plastic frame of the tambourine, it's going to make a little bit of an ugly contact sound. So you should just use your hand on the tambourine. Do not actually strike the tambourine with a stick. Moving on, we're going to start talking about hardness here. So I've got 3 different types of wood blocks. Once again, in order to sort of facilitate the discussion in such a way that it's helpful for educational atmospheres, I wanted to go over a few different ones. This is an extremely nice wood block that a percussionist and carpenter named Eric Bumstead made for me. So this is about as nice as it gets, obviously. This is a slightly less sort of student to intermediate model wood block, slightly less nice, made by a company named Toka. They're a pretty ubiquitous company. And then this is a granite block made by LP, or Latin Percussion. These normally come in a set of 5, so you use those for temple blocks or pitched wood blocks. And obviously these are as hard as a rock. You can run them over with a vehicle and they'll still be in great shape. But regarding the wood block, hardness is important to take into consideration. Most wood blocks are made out of maple. These 2 are both made out of maple. And most drumsticks are made out of hickory, and hickory is significantly harder than maple. So if a composer tells you to use a snare drum stick on the wood block, do not do that. You can if you want, especially if your wood block is pretty durable and it's not a super nice instrument, you can test one time and be like, okay, that's the sound that the composer wants. And then don't do it anymore because you don't want a chance damaging the instrument. So the composer is clearly asking for a stick because the composer wants a hard and articulate sound. So then, as you do with any instrument, if you're not sure what to use, start at the very softest. Is that capturing the effect that the composer wants when they ask for a snare drum stick? No, it's not. So we'll move harder. That's not capturing it either, but it is closer. So we'll move a little harder. That's not getting it either, so a little harder. We're definitely getting closer. That's soft rubber. We'll move to latex. That's capturing it. Remember, the snare drum stick sounded like this, whereas the latex mallet sounds like this. It's a nice, shrill, short, sharp, articulate sound, but it sounds better, it sounds warmer, and it does not sound like I'm punishing the instrument. That's important because obviously, number 1, even if you're not damaging the instrument, we don't want it to sound like we're punishing the instrument. And number 2, we want to make nice sounds because we are performing for people to listen to. So yeah, you want to make sure you make a nice sound, and that leads me to talk about our granite block here. You can play this instrument with a snare drum stick, and you will not damage it. You can actually hit it as hard as you want. You could probably even play it with brass mallets and it wouldn't hurt it. But this is a synthetic version of this, and therefore it should sound the same as this. So if you're going to use something like this to play a wood block and all you have is a granite block, you should still use the same thing so that you're getting a similar sound, so it sounds like a wood block and not like you're striking something with something that's way too hard. Regarding playing zones, if you look at this particular wood block, if you want to zoom in a little bit, you can see I have a wide surface for playing. Most wood blocks are smaller than this one, but what you'll notice is that if I play in the center and close to the mouth of the instrument, I get a great sound. The more off to the side I go, the less of a good sound I get, and the more away from the mouth I go, the less of a good sound I get. So center and close to the mouth, you'll get a great sound. And yeah, this is a TU-40 torque mallet that I was using for that. And that's a little bit about wood blocks / granite blocks. So we'll put those back there. Now we're going to talk a little bit about snare drum and tom-tom. This is an orchestral snare drum. This is a tom-tom off of a drum set. And often students and inexperienced players will think that because it's a drum of some kind, that they usually see being played with sticks, that anytime you have the drum you should play with sticks. That's not necessarily the case, but first of all we'll talk about playing with sticks a little bit. So with the snare drum, if I'm playing here, I get a different sound quality when I move away from the center of the drum. I get less contact sound away from the center of the drum and more contact sound in the center of the drum. With the snares off, I move to the edge, so the less contact sound I get, the more of a soft contact sound I get. Likewise with the tom-tom, you get a softer contact sound when I move away. Oftentimes when you have a piece that's written for snare drum with snares off, or field drum with snares off, or tenor drum or tom-tom, they're trying to emulate something else, an instrument that you don't necessarily have, there's a piece by Ron Nelson called Courtly Airs and Dances, and obviously that's trying to emulate Renaissance music. So the composer, I believe, in that piece just says snare drum, snares off. And 99 times out of 100, the student's just going to grab snare drum sticks in. But that doesn't sound very Renaissance at all. So you might consider thinking outside of the box a little bit. As long as you use something that's softer than the instrument, you will not damage the instrument. So this, for example. Is this softer than the instrument? Yes. It sounds a lot more Renaissance-y. So try to think outside of the box and come up with solutions that are going to capture the essence of the piece that you want to play. Particularly in an educational setting, you'll find that the percussion section tends to be neglected. The conductor will be spending most of the time working with the wind players and the string players on their intonation and their posture and their embouchure and their air support while you're sitting in the back. And while you're sitting in the back waiting / counting rest, you can actually be looking at your music and looking at the title, looking at the style markings, looking at the composer, looking at the composer's lifespan. All of those clues will tell you what kinds of effects you might want to try to produce on the instrument, and therefore what you should use for the instrument. Moving on. Hand drums. So bongos are an example of a hand drum. You can move in a little bit closer if you like. These are made out of hide. It's a very common instruction from the composer to request that the bongos be played with snare drum sticks. That is not a good idea because it is bad for the head of the instrument. So once again, you can take a snare drum stick and kind of get an idea for the reason why the composer is asking you to do that, and then you can gradually work your way from soft to hard. Yeah, we're getting there. You could probably even use some Teflon. That's probably the hardest you want to use. You can hear, yeah, that gives you a nicer sound. And another interesting thing, and this is another reason why you might want to experiment sometimes when you're using a snare drum stick, be it on a drum or a cymbal of some sort, you might want to experiment with using the back end of the stick rather than the tip, because the wider contact surface you're using, the more surface area of the stick will come in contact with more surface area of the drum head or the cymbal or whatever you're hitting, and therefore you'll get sort of a fatter and warmer sound out of it. Likewise with this is even thicker than that is, which is thicker than that is, so you'll get a warmer and fuller sound out of that. Playing zones also make a big difference. All of those playing zones are useful, so that's another important thing to take into consideration. So the last instrument we'll talk about is orchestral bass drum. And I don't have a bass drum mallet on my lovely array of mallets here. That's actually deliberate, because sometimes you don't want to use a bass drum mallet. It's always easy to know which one the bass drum mallet is, but sometimes you either don't want to use one for one reason or another, or you don't have one. So we're going to talk about other options for mallets for bass drum. I'll put a chair here so that we can get ready to dampen it with our leg as we do, and we'll start with the soft timpani mallets. You actually can use timpani mallets on a bass drum, it's fine. You will not damage the mallets and you will not damage the drum either. So, I'll put my foot up, you can see I'm wearing my music socks, which is pretty sweet. Anyway, so what you'll find is that when you're using a mallet that is smaller than a bass drum mallet, and therefore probably harder, but smaller, which is kind of what I was getting at before with back end of the drumsticks and mallets that are greater in circumference than snare drum sticks, is that when you're using a smaller mallet, less surface area of the mallet will come in contact with less surface area of the drum. So the center of the instrument is going to be a more sensitive contact zone, and you'll get a really, really harsh contact sound by striking it in the center, harsher than you would get by striking it in the center with a legitimate bass drum mallet. So to compensate for that, you might want to just move an inch or so away from the center, and you'll find that that will actually mitigate that harshness of contact sound a little bit. You can do a bass drum roll by, similar to suspended cymbal, by moving towards the edges with the mallets fairly far away from each other. You can get a reasonably good sustained sound out of it. And then from there we'll switch to we'll try these Vickfirth Becken mallets. You can hear that, you might be able to hear on the camera, I can certainly hear that, you can hear the contact sounds more. That might actually be good for something like you're trying to get rhythm and definition out of the drum, you can use something like this. And you can start to risk moving harder if you want to, but you want to think about the type of head that your drum has. If you want to move in, you can see, I would highly recommend this particular bass drum head. This is a Weather King Fiberskin 3rd generation bass drum head. And basically what it is it's a synthetic version of calfskin. The Fiberskin 1 heads were horrible, they wouldn't last very long and they would peel and flake off really easily. The Fiberskin 2nd generations were a little bit better. The Fiberskin 3rd generations are absolutely amazing. You can actually even use the back end of snare drum sticks on them, and you can just wail and hammer and they will not dent the head or damage the head at all. They're very, very good heads. So those are the ones I'd recommend. They also make the instrument sound quite a bit bigger than it otherwise would with cheap plastic white heads on it. This is only a 28-inch drum and it sounds pretty good. You can almost even get like a taiko drumming kind of effect out of it when you use snare drum sticks on it. And a variety of other effects, like if I use these really hard yarn mallets, for example. Getting quite a bit of contact sound out of them, not quite as harsh as the snare drum sticks, but there you have it. What to hit what with and where to hit what with what. Thank you for watching.